I'm afraid to say it's not 1998 anymore.
It's just not true that if we go off and build great games, all of a sudden you're going to see console share shift in some dramatic way.
No company should ever allow themselves to be acquired by Microsoft. If you're a gaming company, don't do it. Stay out of it. It's a bad deal.
The year is 2008. Every YouTube video looks like this. Obama is rapidly approaching the White House. Everybody is still fighting to get a Wii. And Banjo Kazooie is getting its first big game in 8 years. 2008 was a pretty good year for video games, all things considered. You had Guns of the Patriots, Smash Bros, Saints Row 2, GTA 4, Left 4 Dead, Mario Kart Wii, and none of those games are Banjo Kazooie. The Nuts and Bolts Act, signed into law in 2012 by President John Arian Jafari, that is his real name, states that you cannot do a video about Banjo Kazooie without doing a recap of the Rareware Microsoft acquisition, even though everybody knows the story already, so here we go. Rare was founded in 1985, evolving out of the existing Ultimate Play the Game, aka Ashby Computers and Graphics Limited, a studio that primarily made games for home PCs such as the ZX Spectrum, they're British so yes, ZX Spectrum, before shifting their focus to the new Nintendo Entertainment System, a platform with a far larger install base than any of those, and rebranding as Rare due to some corporate politics that are not altogether very interesting to talk about. Shifting to Nintendo's platforms, they made a lot of great games and also a bunch of LJN published movie tie-ins, which, yeah, according to Wikipedia, Rare, the company who made GoldenEye, also made Who Framed Roger Rabbit for the NES. And that's what we call range. Then in 1994, Nintendo started buying huge stakes in the company after being greatly impressed by their advancements in 3D technology. The previous year, Nintendo gave them the go-ahead to make a Donkey Kong game using their fancy new SGI workstations. It might be hard for younger gamers to understand today, but the resulting game, Donkey Kong Country, was basically the Crisis of platformers at the time. Then again, that's probably a dated reference too, but the point is, nobody, least of all Nintendo themselves, could have imagined that a Super Nintendo game could look that good. Since graphics have always been the most important thing since the beginning of recorded history, this allowed the game to sell 9 million copies. Nintendo realized they had something special with this team, so they made them a second-party developer, and they made a whole bunch of genre-defining titles. You had 2 more Donkey Kong Countries, Killer Instinct, GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, Conker's Bad Fur Day, and yes, Banjo Kazooie. From the outside, they seemed like an unstoppable duo, just like the bear and the bird themselves. They were a good fit for each other. Rare was more than happy to put out cute, family-friendly stuff that was in line with Nintendo's brand image, but also some hardcore shooty games once in a while to appeal to the real men. But while it may have seemed from a distance that everything was going well, it wasn't going to last. Nintendo became disappointed with Rare not long after the turn of the millennium, frustrated over their apparent inability to get enough big dog games on their new GameCube system. Not to mention family-friendly Nintendo might have felt a little bit queasy over Conker, which was only made worse by the fact that it only moved about 55,000 copies, making it, objectively, a commercial failure. So while it definitely has cult status doesn't make the line go up. The only game Rare managed to put out for the Cube was 2002's Star Fox Adventures, a game that was, to say the least, a little bit divisive. Critics generally liked it, praising the excellent graphics and the occasionally innovative gameplay, and it was commercially relatively successful, but it didn't really strike a chord with Star Fox fans. Star Fox Adventures is a fascinating case study in the history of Nintendo's bizarre decision-making process, and was possibly the earliest great example of how not to innovate with your beloved video game series, and how a game that is largely great in its own right can be so poorly received just by making the mistake of putting it in the wrong series and trying to sell it to the wrong audience. Write this down in your notebooks because it's going to be very important. Given the circumstances, I think a brief history lesson on Star Fox Adventures is in order. This game began its life on the Nintendo 64 as a hugely ambitious action-adventure game titled Dinosaur Planet. Taking heavy inspiration from the 3D Zelda games at the time, it followed two Fox characters, Saber and Crystal. The player would control either character alternatively to solve puzzles using a very forward-looking and innovative system for the time. Not to mention the graphics were absolutely insane for N64 standards, to the point that it could barely run on the system. The original idea for Dinosaur Planet was never fully realized, but an unfinished build of the game did find its way onto the internet a few years ago, and it can be loaded and played through emulation, which is actually quite fascinating. Playing through this unfinished game made me feel like I had unearthed an archaeological text, like a stone tablet that the Romans used to write Roman stuff. It's also a window into a different potential timeline of history. Had this game delivered on its original vision, Star Fox might look very different today, and Rare might look very different as well, not to mention Crystal would also look pretty different. You know, maybe this game isn't so bad. Part of the way through development, Miyamoto chimed in and basically said that the game should be modified to use the Star Fox license, since it didn't make sense to have two separate Nintendo series both following a fox. So Saber got folded into Fox McCloud, the project was shifted over to the Nintendo GameCube, the scope of the project was greatly revised, Crystal was completely sidelined and became Sleepy Furry Bait, and they sold the game as Star Fox Adventures.
What am I doing?
They took a series about shooting boulders and giant robo-space mechs and said, okay, the next game is Zelda. Now, if you're going to rip off any game, there are far worse games to rip off than Zelda, and depending who you ask, the game is actually really fucking good. I mean, even I kinda like it, to tell you the truth, but if you were a big Star Fox fan, a guy who just wanted to shoot more stuff in space, this game felt like a betrayal of your trust. But hey, at least Fox has a hot wife now. I sure hope they don't retcon her out of existence like a photo of Stalin. Anyways, Rare puts out one game for the GameCube. It was commercially successful-ish, but core fans were disappointed with it, and Nintendo was getting a little cranky about all this, even though it was basically their fault, but who cares? While this is happening, Microsoft is entering the video game console space with the Xbox, and they need to start thinking long term. They need studios, they need creators, they need developers.
Yes!
So on his way to visit his buddy Jeff, Bill Gates went window shopping for new studios to make games for their new box, and hey, what a coincidence. Here's this studio that made a shitload of really good games in the previous generation whose parent company is currently not happy with their output. So Microsoft approaches Nintendo with this deal. They're like, okay, we'll give you $375 million and all the awesome games that practically carried your previous console belong to us now. And Nintendo said, hell yeah, you got a deal. Banjo Kazooie Perfect Dark, who cares? The GameCube don't need no games to compete with no PS2. For a while, there was a rumor that Microsoft bought Rare because they thought they would get the Donkey Kong license along with it, but that wasn't true. It did, however, get them all of Rare's original properties and artistic talent, and golly gee, I can't wait to see what they do with them. I mean, surely Microsoft, of all companies, wouldn't spend hundreds of millions of dollars to buy a video game company that owns a bunch of beloved intellectual properties and hugely talented creative leads just to basically do nothing with them for over 20 years, right? Yeah, but at least they still have Halo, son of a bitch. Anyway, it seemed like Rare would still be doing its thing for a while. They had some stuff going on. Conker got a full remake on the original Xbox, and even though I don't care for the new art direction, I think it's technically very impressive for its time. This is an Xbox 360 here. This is Xbox One, but not that one, this one. The first console in the Xbox series of console, but not that series, this one. What does it look like inside of your head, Microsoft? Then there was Grabbed by the Ghoulies, Cameo, Viva Pinata, and you know, these were fine, right? They were solid games, but it was clear that they were beginning to taper off. The magic wasn't quite the same. These games weren't topping the best sellers list, right? I mean, nobody was buying an Xbox just to play Viva Pinata like they might have bought an N64 just to play GoldenEye. Then into the 2010s, they started making shovelware for the Kinect. You remember that, right?
As you can see, when I start making movements with my avatar, it instantly mimics me on screen.
But until they made Sea of Thieves, which is probably their greatest contribution to the gaming medium in the last decade, their output had been pretty underwhelming. I mean, in the time it took them to get 4 or 5 7 out of 10s, they would have gotten 6 or 7 9 out of 10s under Nintendo. But out of the games that they did manage to put out under the Red Ring of Death, the most famous and possibly infamous game they put out was 2008's Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. I can still remember when I first saw Nuts and Bolts. I must have been like 10 years old, and I was in the school library, and there was a shelf full of magazines. Among those was the usual educational crap that I didn't really care about, or pop culture nonsense about Justin Bieber or whoever was popular back then. But there was one magazine, I think it was PC Gamer or Game Informer, something of that caliber anyway. I don't remember if I picked it up and started reading or if I just saw the cover, but on/in this magazine was a render of a weird looking bear holding a wrench, smiling like a DreamWorks character, folding his arms, looking all badass, and a title that said Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. Now that got my attention big time. Back then, I was all about the old retro games, or what counted as a retro game for a 10-year-old, which usually meant games that were barely 10 years old at most. Among those, of course, was Banjo Kazooie, and here I was staring at a new Banjo game in a gamer magazine. I remember this image being captivating. I wondered why the characters looked so different from how I remembered them looking, and I was especially curious about the fact that it was on Xbox. That's peculiar. I had always associated Banjo Kazooie with Rare and Nintendo. Back then, I wasn't plugged into the Matrix yet, so I had no idea about the Microsoft acquisition, but when I went on the computer one fateful day, I made that unfortunate discovery, and from that moment on, I became the Joker. Now, I think most people who've played 1998's Banjo-Kazooie will agree that it's a great game, perhaps even a masterpiece depending on who you're talking to. But it's also kind of a miraculous video game, all things considered. Beginning its development as a fantasy action RPG for the Super Nintendo under the codename Project Dream using the graphical technology of Donkey Kong Country, the game originally followed a boy named Edison who had a sword and a dog sidekick. The game then shifted development over to the Nintendo 64, which was rapidly approaching release. Shortly thereafter, they started changing and modifying various elements of the story and the overall tone of the game, while the protagonist, Edison, remained unchanged and was starting to seem out of place in a world that he wasn't originally designed for. So after exploring alternatives to a sword guy, they landed on a honey bear named Banjo. After revising the scope of the project, shifting the gameplay direction towards a 2.5D platformer, they built a rudimentary 3D game engine which was dramatically revised after the developers saw an early version of Super Mario 64. Like everybody else who was making games at that time, once they saw the new Mario, they said, "Oh, that's how you make a video game." So the project was restarted once again, now with a 3D game engine bearing much more resemblance to Mario 64, and in June of 1998, the game was released to virtually unanimous critical acclaim and sold 3 million copies, which was a lot back then. If you compare it to other big games that year like Ocarina of Time, Half-Life, or Metal Gear Solid, Banjo might not have been a groundbreaking before and after type game, if you will, but it was just damn good fun. You had catchy music, vibrant and colorful worlds, rewarding exploration, excellent pacing, great controls, and just for good measure, it had really funny writing and dialogue. In Donkey's not-so-favorable review of Yooka-Laylee, he attributes the term confident simplicity to Banjo Kazooie's game design, and I think that sums it up perfectly. Banjo Kazooie is not a complicated video game. It's not a mechanically dense game with obtuse mechanics and gameplay systems that take you years to figure out. It's a very simple yet very focused game that delivers where it counts. You see a giant snowman smoking a pipe and you think, I bet there's something inside the pipe, and what do you know, it's a Jiggy. That's what Banjo Kazooie is. It's a very exciting game with compact, imaginative levels that you want to explore because they pique your curiosity with distinctive landmarks. Even though the gameplay itself is largely simple, Rare took great care in the details. Everything you pick up gives you a fun little jingle. And the music will actually change instruments depending on which part of the level you're in. It's those little touches that elevate Banjo from being a fun game to being a Rare game. Then, 2 years later, they made Banjo-Tooie. This was a bigger and more ambitious game, and it was also critically and commercially successful for its time. It's often seen as just a straight-up great sequel, you know, it built upon the foundation of Banjo-Kazooie while embellishing it with more powerful and intricate movesets and bigger worlds with better graphics and more audacious writing. The game is not without its critics, to be sure. Some people find the levels to be too big and sprawling, and it's very easy to get lost. And unlike Kazooie, where you can usually get everything in a level in one go, Tooie expects you to backtrack to previous levels after you unlock late game abilities. But you see, what people don't get about Banjo-Tooie is that the game is actually a Metroidvania. You run up against roadblocks, places you can't get to, items you can't obtain that will drive you crazy, but you'll remember them in 7 hours when you actually find the move you need in order to solve the puzzle. Every level connects to another level through secret tunnels and branching pathways. In some places you can't get to unless you enter through another exit in another world. I don't expect everyone to understand this, but I love Banjo-Tooie, I just don't get tired of it. And with such a great sequel, it makes you wonder, where will Banjo go next? And 2008's Nuts and Bolts was the very confusing answer. The most common generic complaint about Banjo Nuts and Bolts is that the game is about building vehicles and driving vehicles, whereas Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie were both 3D platformer adventure games, games with inventive platforming and an engaging sense of discovery, where you would enter into a big world and just start jumping around finding shiny stuff. Yes, Banjo Nuts and Bolts is also a platformer, kinda. There is a sense of discovery and some rewarding exploration, but fundamentally the big thing of Nuts and Bolts is building cars, planes, and boats, and driving them around to complete a bunch of missions. Virtually every single review of the game back then would make this the focal point of their criticisms. Essentially that this is not a Banjo-Kazooie game at its core, despite saying the words Banjo-Kazooie on the box. Thing is, no matter how well this game delivered on its actual creative vision, it was kind of doomed from the start, simply as a consequence of what it actually is. The highest praise you would hear could basically be summarized as saying, it's a good game, but it's a bad Banjo-Kazooie game. You know the song and dance by now. A game comes out, it's great in its own right, maybe, but longtime fans feel that it fully misses the mark aesthetically with respect to the series' foundational appeals, and even the faintest of praise of the game must be cushioned with qualifying statements that it was inappropriate to put it in a long-running series like this. And this is as good a time as any to circle back to Star Fox Adventures. The irony of Banjo Nuts and Bolts being the first, and I guess last Banjo game produced originally for the Xbox line of hardware, is that what they did with this game is what I would call a Nintendo move. To make a new entry in a beloved series and gamble on completely changing it at a fundamental level instead of just making a straightforward sequel. That's something that Nintendo would do, and when Nuts and Bolts was made by Rare, it's something Nintendo already did to Star Fox using Rare. One might assume that Rare would put a big pin in that and say, okay, Dinosaur Planet is great as long as we don't put the characters from the shooty space game in it. Therefore, if we decide to make a cool vehicle construction game, what are we not gonna do? Put the silly platformer mascots in it. So from that perspective, a game like Nuts and Bolts only becomes more baffling. The lesson they would learn from this game is a lesson they should have already learned with Star Fox Adventures. Much like Star Fox, people who were able to set aside the fact that it wasn't a proper Banjo game saw it for what it was, and while nobody called it perfect or a masterpiece, they did say it was a great and inventive game. One that proved that Rare could still be an innovative developer. But again, it wasn't Banjo Kazooie. If it was some other brand, some other universe, some other characters, it would have likely been received better.
When I really said we should make Banjo bloody 3, we should make Banjo 3, that's what people want to see. But at the time, it looked like platform games weren't, because there was an era when platform games weren't as popular, people wanted the shooters and all that kind of stuff, and so I think we all thought it wouldn't sell and people wouldn't want to play a game like that.
He later clarified that he felt that Nuts and Bolts was a great game, but just that it was a mistake to use the Banjo-Kazooie license. This is interesting though. Essentially, they made something that wasn't a 3D platformer because 3D platformers weren't trendy anymore, at least as far as they could tell. They were worried it wouldn't sell. This confuses me a little bit. Like, yeah, shooters were hugely popular at the time, but that doesn't mean everyone who enjoyed platformers just stopped existing, right? Super Mario Galaxy is considered one of the greatest games ever made, and it came out a whole year before Nuts and Bolts and the same year as Halo 3. I have to wonder, at any point during the development process, did they stop and ask, yeah, okay, is this a good idea? The most charitable interpretation of that, I think, is that they were trying to take into account their platform audience, At that time, Xbox had tried to position itself as an elite pro gamer box, the console you buy because you're a sweaty man who works at a shipping facility, and not a gay Nintendo baby from Loserville. Perhaps they thought the hardcore Halo box just couldn't have a cute, whimsical platformer, either because Xbox fans wouldn't buy it, or because they thought it would damage the Xbox's badass brand image, which, of course, little did they know that the Kinect was gonna do that anyway, but whatever. I'd like to think that, had they had the chance to do over, they would have the wisdom not to follow what they thought was a trend, and to just make the game they probably wanted to make originally. Just the following year, Demon's Souls came out and virtually invented an entire subgenre simply by acting in defiance of trends. Everyone loves a rebel, The bottom line is this. Regardless of its actual quality, Nuts and Bolts is objectively out of step with Banjo tradition. The game itself is even aware of this and acknowledges it frequently, but tries to bury it under a layer of irony. When Log, the new antagonist of the game, is introduced, he has a little routine that they probably thought was funny, but to most Banjo fans probably felt more condescending and kind of insulting in context. This is the first Banjo-Kazooie game 8 years after another game was teased at the end of Banjo-Tooie, and we're gonna open the game with a joke where the characters run around grabbing spinning golden objects all sluggishly, as though this is just what Banjo-Kazooie was, before saying, this is too painful, see? You don't want this, nah, you just want to shoot stuff like Call of Duty and Halo. As though there is just no substantive difference between exploring a big fancy level for collectibles and slowly steering a fat-ass bear through a line of little tokens that don't do anything. This is how a disingenuous Twitter user who hates Banjo-Kazooie would describe the game. It's supposed to be a funny joke, but in context, feels more like a bad faith attempt to try and make the old Banjo formula look worse than it actually is. Probably the most famous Nuts and Bolts video for now and for the rest of time is JonTron's video. Today, the substance of the criticisms and the commentary are a little bit lulzy, if you will. Like, today, there would probably be a bunch of ass-long Twitter threads about how he didn't give the game enough credit or whatever, but it's over a decade old, so I don't hold it against him. I bring it up only because this video is, to this day, probably a lot of people's only actual exposure to the game. Watching this video would have you believe that the devil himself pulled this game out of the blackest depths of hell and thrust it upon humanity as a divine punishment for all of our sins. Back in those days, treating a slightly mediocre game or even a game that you don't particularly care for as though it was actual demon spawn, that was pretty much just the style at the time, as though Banjo Nuts and Bolts is a sin, a true sin, an ultimate crime against the gaming community. That's basically a direct quote, by the way.
This is a sin. This is a true sin. An ultimate crime against the entire gaming community.
Looking back and seeing the completely earnest gravity with which the mere existence of a game we don't like is treated by gaming YouTubers, it's really funny. Thankfully, we've gotten a lot better about not treating our opinions as gospel and using extreme hyperbole to win arguments where logic cannot. A lot of people have taken issue with this video in retrospect, and some people will even tell you that JonTron is singularly responsible for ruining this game's reputation, which is obviously not true, but there is a really great quote in the video. A quote that reveals a lot and is a good springboard for an enlightening dialogue.
I hate the fact that I have to hate this game. In an era where developers are piss scared to take a tiptoe outside the proverbial box, it's actually nice to see something with a hint of originality. But this is not the way to do it!
I hate the fact that I have to hate this game. This whole quote is great for a number of reasons. First of all, it's just as true today that developers are frightened of taking actual risks, and while originality would be greatly appreciated, hijacking a beloved series for it is still a bad idea. It was a bad idea when they made Star Fox Adventures, it was a bad idea when they made Banjo Nuts and Bolts, and it was a really bad idea when they made Star Fox Zero for the stupid Wii U. But it's also a great quote because it contextualizes a lot of the attitudes towards this game. It's hardly a stretch at all to imagine that a lot of people felt they had a moral duty to hate this game just so Rareware and Microsoft got the memo that, look, Banjo Kazooie is a platformer and it looks like this. Not this, this, not this, winner, loser. Therefore, a lot of these people, if they did decide to play this game, the entire playthrough would have gone through the filter of finding things to get upset about while ignoring any positive quality of the game or anything that could even be interpreted as a positive quality. Thankfully, nobody ever does that today for anything ever. I think this could have just as easily applied to John as anybody else. Revisiting this video all these years later, something that is conspicuously absent from this review is footage of anything that isn't either the intro on Spiral Mountain, the first level, or the hub world. I guess there were like 4 seconds of footage from the Coliseum, but I don't think that's his own footage because there's a watermark in the corner. This doesn't prove anything on its own necessarily, but I wouldn't be shocked at all if John wrote most of the entire video before playing the game, then played it for 2 hours purely to get the necessary footage with little to no intention of making any more observations than, "The game isn't Banjo 3, therefore it's bad. Ugh." Like a lot of people, I think it's very possible that the decision to paint it as a trash can bitch of a game was made before he even played it. Hating Nuts and Bolts was about more than hating Nuts and Bolts the video game. It was about sending a message. I don't know what it looks like inside of every gamer's head, but I know from personal experience that I found games like Paper Mario Sticker Star and Color Splash to be sufficiently repulsive as a Paper Mario fan that I often approach discussions about those games in very much the same way. Considering how similar the dynamic is, I wouldn't be shocked at all if this was the mentality. But of course, all of these critiques, all of these criticisms, these are refusing to judge the game on its own terms, to dismiss the game entirely because of what it isn't, while ignoring what it is. So I think it's finally time to start talking about what it actually is. So the game begins with a recap telling you the story of how Banjo and Kazooie defeated Gruntilda twice and have basically just been vibing for 8 years and now they're all fat and washed up. There might be some symbolism here, but I can't say for sure. Grunty, who is just ahead, confronts them and they go to fight each other, but the battle is interrupted by the Lord of Games, or Log for short. He calls himself the grand creator of all games, and before you get mad, this game was written before Sticker Star came out, just for clarity. He decides to have some fun with our heroes and gives them an ultimatum. Banjo-Kazooie and Grunty are going to compete, and to the winner goes Spiral Mountain, and the loser will be cursed to make games in Log's Game Factory for the rest of time. because of course there is no greater punishment than being forced to work in game development for a company that is owned by Microsoft. They get new bodies and are sent to the new hub world, Showdown Town. Here you get the rundown of how the game works. This is a game about building vehicles and deploying them into the game world to complete the various challenges. At first, the avalanche of tutorials is exhausting, especially considering it's a Banjo Kazooie game. Banjo superfans will remember that you can actually skip the tutorial in Banjo Kazooie, and like Mario 64, it's not really a game where you need a lot of tutorials anyway, but this game is not quite as naturally intuitive, so it is kinda necessary. The builder is a little intimidating and cumbersome at first, but once you slowly get used to it, you'll start to really like it, at least I did. It might seem like there are a lot of things to keep track of at first, but it becomes very intuitive if you just put in the time. You can open the builder pretty much whenever you want, and any design you make can be saved and brought out at any time. You can even modify blueprints you already have, so you don't have to start from scratch. If you don't feel like making your own vehicle, there are level-specific blueprints and even special ones that you can buy from Humba Wumba, who looks like this now. That's not what Humba Wumba looks like. Her hair is different. One of the first things I noticed about the game was the presentation. Graphically, it looks great for 2008. You got some real shiny gold and some real bumpy bump maps. It's very appealing most of the time, and was a much needed burst of color in an era where games kept trying to look like American Goddamn Sniper. The thing that really started to irritate me was the performance issues. There are moments where the frame rate goes way down and even stops and stutters like a modern game built on Unreal 5. Again, it's from 2008, but it's not like every game from that era would freeze every time you open a menu or some bullshit like this. There are a lot of cutscenes where the whole game will stop so that the virtual camera can load the next shot. Like, come on man, this is Xbox 360, that's no good. I assumed these issues would be better on later versions of the game on Rare Replay, but according to my research, it's actually worse. I don't know how they fucked that up. The next thing I noticed was the character designs. As I mentioned, Humba is basically unrecognizable, but most of the other characters are different, but still distinctly themselves. Banjo has this funky angular design, which kinda makes sense because he's now an Xbox character, so he has to have a more boxy frame, an Xboxy frame if you will. Also, whenever he falls off a cliff, he kinda sounds like Hank Hill, which it's not really a problem, it's just kinda funny. Kazooie looks like she yells at minimum wage workers for hours, Grunty is Grunty, Klungo is Bungo, but the weirdest designs are most of the new characters. Half the time, they don't even look like Banjo or Rare characters, they look more like they came from back at the barnyard. My favorite is Chester Cheetah's gay cousin, Trophy Thomas, who the game is more than happy to point out looks like he came from a different video game, just in case you thought the character designers were being goofy. But they weren't actually being goofy, they were just satirizing the act of being goofy. You know, now that I see him again, he looks kinda like Ninja. If the game came out today, there'd be a QTE sequence where you had to do Fortnite dances with the Kinect. Even the weirder designs are still carried by the expressive and lively animations, and all the moving parts are very next-gen for their time, all things considered. I think the thing that routinely steals the show, however, is the music. With the power of Xbox DVDs, the game can now have recorded music from a big balls brass band. The game cleverly remixes a lot of old tunes into some new songs, never losing that spark of inspiration but always keeping the past alive. My favorite song though is the mashup of all the old tunes you hear in Banjoland. In particular, the Freeze Easy Peak part sounds like a goddamn John Williams Christmas score. I half expected Tim Allen dressed as Santa to show up. I am a little more mixed on the writing, to tell you the truth. Banjo Kazooie was famous for breaking the fourth wall from time to time and even having some subtle innuendo in their writing, but Nuts and Bolts sometimes feels like it's trying a little bit too hard, like this Jinjo who catches himself before completing the phrase sweating like a hooker in church.
You brought a hooker to church?
But what about this guy who was in a quote bare chat room that was all perfectly innocent? Was Jolly there? The vehicle customization is really exciting as you progress through the game. Hidden throughout Showdown Town are these little crates full of new vehicle parts, and notes can be used to purchase even more on top of that. It's not just engines, wheels, wings, and propellers. You got all kinds of things like guns that shoot eggs, mounted turrets, and... What I love the most about the customization is just how little restraint there was in allowing you to make whatever you want. I went into this game expecting to be told, no, you can't do that, no, you can't do that, no, you can't put a mounted turret on top of a giant stack of ammo packs and fuel tanks to put yourself physically closer to the enemies to hit them better. It was very exciting to see a pre-Breath of the Wild game put so much trust in the player to allow them to make up some lunatic plan and put it into action. The game is more than happy to let you try something stupid. Let's fucking go, boy. Wait, shit, I forgot the wheels. No. Damn it. The most rewarding moments in the game by far are the moments where you come up against a mission that's frustrating or infuriating and you're getting ready to throw the controller out the window, but wait, maybe it occurs to you that you're approaching it in the wrong way. That's when you go into the builder and realize that there's a smarter way to do this, there's a better vehicle for the job. I had one mission where I just naturally assumed I had to take to the sky and do a good old-fashioned Star Fox dogfight, but I just couldn't hit anything for the life of me. And then it occurred to me that driving up with a mounted turret might be a much more effective strategy, and indeed it was. A lot of missions will have you running up against these stupidly specific problems that demand these very ad hoc solutions, and you end up making a terrible abomination of engineering that maybe looks a little something like this. I wouldn't be surprised at all if I went through someone else's Nuts and Bolts file and found something like this and I said, oh, you got stuck in that mission too? When Tears of the Kingdom came out, there were a lot of comparisons to Nuts and Bolts with respect to the vehicle building, and I didn't realize just how deep the comparisons went until I started putting additional fuel tanks on the P-Quad to make it drive longer. I gotta be honest though, I kinda like Nuts and Bolts better. I felt more engaged, like they expected more from me as a player. Besides, can you put a mounted turret that shoots eggs on your Tears of the Kingdom hoverbike thing? Well, maybe you can, but I never did. For all the customization in this game, there's nothing that will match the game-breaking power of recall, so you're always encouraged to think about what you're doing. It's not a game that you can play on autopilot most of the time. There's no magic beat the game button you can put on your car. It was really rewarding to get access to more and more vehicle parts as the game progressed until I could make these absolute monstrosities of engineering. In a weird way, returning to the early game levels with a broken vehicle was a lot like returning to the starting area of an RPG, now that your character is like level 58. There is a very real feeling of getting more and more powerful as the game progresses. The missions can be very fun, but I also had a lot of fun flying around on my hazardous death contraption just to see what there is to see around the big worlds. I was pleasantly surprised to discover that most of the worlds that seemed empty at first were actually hiding a lot of fun secrets from time to time. Obviously, this is not quite the same kind of rewarding exploration you'd get from a classic Banjo game, but it'd be unfair to imply that they weren't trying at all. Throughout the world, you'll find remnants of stop and swap, and without looking it up, it's not clear to me if there are actual secrets here or if the game is just elaborately trolling the player. It wouldn't surprise me at all. During the final mission, there's a quiz with Log where he asks you the name of the supposed link between Kazooie and Tooie that the fan sites won't shut up about. Listen, Log, I know you hate Banjo fans. You made that very clear in the intro, but we're not the ones who put it in the game, alright? Early on, a lot of the issues I had with this game were more structural than anything else. Take for instance the Jiggy system. In this game, Jiggies aren't collected by just finding them throughout the world like the old titles. Instead, you have to complete missions and challenges, and if you do them well enough, you will earn a Jiggy in that world-specific Jiggy dispenser in Showdown Town. You then have to drive in front of the dispenser, dispense the Jiggies into your vehicle, then drive them all the way down to the Jiggy bank in the center of town to deposit them. I don't know, this seems like a lot of extra steps, don't you think? I think it would have been nice to be able to find some Jiggies just lying around in the open, But I'm not a game designer, they know best. Showdown Town is a very fun hub world to explore, which I didn't expect, to tell you the truth. Your vehicle options are a lot more limited here, but as you progress through the game, your Showdown Town cart slowly gets new upgrades that let you get around more easily. It's a very happy and lively place on the surface, and there are a lot of fun little secrets to find. But there is a much more sinister element hiding underneath. Jinjos are placed in prison for reasons that are never made clear, so you can break them out and return them to their homes for some extra notes. Doing this will upset the police, but they'll forgive you and actually pay you money if you can replace them with a Minjo, which in this game look very different from Jinjos, wearing a prison outfit and handcuffs. The extrapolated logic here, I think, is that these evil Minjos broke out of prison and the police couldn't get a hold of them, so they just grabbed some innocent Jinjos off the street because they look similar enough and threw them in prison just to meet their quota. This is a messed up little game. One of my favorite parts of Showdown Town is Klungo, who made his own arcade game where all you have to do is jump at the right moment. It's actually surprisingly challenging because you really have to commit to the perfect timing. Also, King Jingaling is back and he has a new venture, Jinjo Bingo, where you place Jinjo tokens on this tile to unlock a bunch of secret goodies. How do you get Jinjo tokens? Well, by completing Jinjo challenges in the game's various worlds. You see, in this game, Jinjos now have the ability to turn into a giant ball, and because of this, you now have to sumo wrestle them out of an arena and punch them so hard they go fucking flying into the stratosphere. It doesn't make sense, and it doesn't have to. I mean, just look at him go. Banjo Nuts and Bolts is admittedly a very fun game most of the time, but even judging it on its own terms, it does have some bumpy parts, especially near the end. Fun missions that encourage creativity start to give way to frustrating missions where you're just fighting against the game half the time, praying that it just chooses not to screw you over by flipping you or spinning you out of control because you hit a tiny voxel on the screen too fast or at a slightly weird angle. It's the type of shit where it's not enough to do the right thing. You have to do the right thing at the same time the game decides not to be a dickhead. There's a real bad one in Banjo Land Act 6 where you have to race Klungo around on a shitty contraption of his own making. And to make matters worse, the racetrack is just a sheet of slippery ice and the game will look for any excuse to make the vehicle lose traction. It doesn't matter how careful or slow you are, this thing just loses control way too easily. Isn't it enough that I'm driving this shitty thing that I have no say in using? No, it isn't enough, because if you crash into any of these stop and swap eggs, an enemy will come out of it and just kick your ass some more. This mission is the poster child for just poorly designed nonsense, where any one of these individual elements would have been frustrating enough, but to have all three of them at the same time just paints a picture of an evil designer who woke up and decided not to have any restraint one day. It's just not fun to go to war with the Havoc physics engine, which is ultimately what the game turns into in its worst moments. The game is at its best when it gives you a wealth of options to choose from, so it only makes sense that it's at its worst when it starts taking options away. But even so, I really did think the fun times outweighed these moments on the whole. I mean, if I actually do the math, these moments were just that. They were moments. Blemishes on an otherwise fun experience. And that to me is what Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts is. The game's fun factor is not completely unalloyed by bullshit, but clearly it still has one. Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts was a gamble. It was risky. Counterintuitively, by looking at market trends and making their game based on that, they took an enormous risk by changing the direction of a beloved franchise. The developers wanted to try other things, and they had faith that the audience, that we, would judge it by what it was trying to do and love it for what it is. They took a chance, they made a gamble, and this time they lost. They lost the worst kind of gamble to lose in the gaming world, to bet on reintroducing classic characters while fundamentally changing and replacing the classic foundational appeals. They made the first big Banjo game in years and steered away from what made the originals so great. Regardless of its quality, it's not what the fans wanted, what they needed. It should have been a great sequel to Banjo-Tooie, and for most people, this wasn't that. But now that the dust has settled on this ancient history, I think it's completely fair to say that this is a great game in its own right. It's not as consistent on its own terms as the other games are, but it still has a lot going for it. If they ever do make another Banjo-Kazooie, Would I want it to be Nuts and Bolts 2? Absolutely not. I will always want Banjo 3E, or I guess 4E, but I don't want this game to be forgotten. I think while the initial reaction was completely understandable, we don't have anything to lose almost 2 decades later by enjoying it and praising it for what it does correctly, and I don't know what we have to gain by continuing to drag it through the mud. I played a lot of games this year, both old and new, and honestly, Nuts and Bolts actually stands out even among those. It's definitely one of the most unique games that I've played this year, and I had more fun with it than I'm having with Borderlands 4, I'll tell you that. And there's something really special about that, about enjoying something that you kept hearing was awful. It's certainly a better feeling than hating something everyone told you was great. It's a wonderful thing. And if you've been reluctant to try Nuts and Bolts because you kept hearing about what an absolute disgrace it is, I'm telling you, give it a chance. You have nothing to lose. Except maybe $10 on eBay.